and mute Ed.
Okay. And then I am going to share screen. I'm going to go, first of all, to the handout that I put out today. It's a single, but I will tell you that I would have sent out the actual presentation with 6 pages on each page. You would get the presentation, but I was having trouble. We were lucky yesterday that we could do what we could do. And so I will send this for now. And if you want the other, in fact, Karen, I'll just send it along to Mary so that she can share it if she wants to people, and we'll get ours shared here because there's more. And this has so many, so much history behind it and so many things in the slides that I did not put in the resource materials that I really would like you to have that. But I'm going to call special attention on your CCC list. I know your libraries. There isn't a library in Montana that does not have Stan Cohen's book, The Tree Army, A Pictorial History of the CCC. It's a wonderful book. The only disadvantage is, of course, it doesn't name names and it doesn't tell you too much about where to get those names. So I'm going to come off of that for now. If you hear voices in the background at all here, it means that some people are working in the next room over, and hopefully they just left. So we should be okay. And I'm going to stop the share on this, and then I will go out to the actual screen for my presentation. And we'll get it started from the beginning. So Civilian Conservation Corps records really fascinate me when I look at the history of the Great Depression and what happened, because of course, when I'm talking about my relatives, I'm still young enough that I have uncles, not my dad, but I have uncles who participated in that Civilian Conservation Corps. I believe my Uncle Roy, just as an aside here, I think he probably participated in something up by Glacier Park. I still don't have total verification of that, but getting his records will be exciting because records are available. They do cost anywhere from $20 to $70. I will warn you of that. So let's just set the stage with regard to this Civilian Conservation Corps, which, by the way, has been a real model for some of the things that we do today in working with youth who need some help, need some understanding. And since it was such a well-modeled program, it has been used again and again as we work with youth. The Great Depression in the United States began about the time of the great stock market crash in October 29. But I'm going to tell you right now, in Montana, we see deep signs of the coming of a Great Depression by 1919, just immediately after World War I. Well, issues were being settled there. By those signs, I mean, one of the first things that happened, of course, is Prohibition passed. And Montana passed that law 1 year earlier, actually, than the rest of the United States. And we saw a sign for the Great Depression immediately at county and state levels because there was no immediate way for the state nor the counties to make up the revenue that they lost in terms of liquor sales, because they didn't have the liquor sale thing then at the state level, but they were taking in taxes at the county level and sometimes at the city level, depending on the place. And of course, that affected the state. We saw a great downturn in the amount of money available to take care of each county's needs. And that was statewide. Washington had the same thing to a lesser extent, but they suffered it. I found at least one article with that. So let's think about the Great Depression really affecting us even a little earlier than just that stock market crash, which wasn't just a crash, by the way. in October of 29. High unemployment was immediate. Banks and companies and businesses failed in great numbers. In Montana, they started failing right away, 1920, through 1922, when we had a great deal of bank failures in Montana because they were not equipped. They did not have the money on hand to take care of people when they needed to withdraw large sums of money or even just their itty bitty sums of money. By 1932, about 13 million Americans were unemployed, and they feel that that's an understatement of the actual number, but that's what they could verify immediately, that those people were unemployed and in need of some kind of help. Unemployment in those days, of course, there were no programs really to take care of anything for people. I mean, in Montana, we had a voluntary program in which we could take care of some people who were oldsters who needed a little bit of help. And of course, we had things like a poor farm, but we just really did not have the means to be able to take care of a lot of families all at once. We were taking care of some widows and orphans, some divorcees and orphans, various families, but those were not huge programs across the state. Franklin Roosevelt proposed reforestation programs, which he focused on not only because he had a vital interest in forests, but he also knew that that was something that hadn't produced any kind really of business taxes, et cetera, or anything. There was nothing with that. And what he said was, we can do this kind of neutral program. We can use our money to help people get back on their feet, and it will be helping us with things that we really need help with, like soil erosion and things like flood control, and just looking at the fire situations in parks and in the U.S. Forest Service. Remember, until 1906, which was only 25 years before that, we'd been under the auspices of a thing called U.S. Forest Reserve, and they had had some of the same goals, but they'd been quite small in comparison. Meanwhile, we were proposing and getting into more national and state parks across the United States each year. President Roosevelt managed to get this past Congress. And CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, its official name, it was a New Deal program of his, and just one of the programs started in 1933. I'm flashing this because I'm hoping that if you look at your family records at all, and somewhere in there you see things with this sign, you see young men, sometimes in military-like dress, but often in rougher dress, just whatever they had at the time, dungarees, et cetera, to give them, that you might cue to the fact that in your family history, you've got a Civilian Conservation Corps member. And you'll save those pictures and figure out where those were. This one stays pretty much like this. The symbol does. Sometimes it's yellow and green. Sometimes it's white and green. This was established again to cut the unemployment during the Great Depression, providing national conservation work primarily for young unmarried men. Now, immediately where they said these people had to be 18 to 25 years old, and they were guaranteed 1 year of service at least in which they could send some money home, et cetera. They also made some exceptions. Veterans who had not been employed, couldn't find work after World War I, were not having a good time. For them, there was no age requirement attached if they wanted to join this, and they could be married. They could not bring their families, they could not bring their spouses, but they could be married. So you may occasionally find some vets there. Actually, many of those vets almost immediately were co-opted into working, and especially since they had been in the Army, they had a certain sense of army orderliness. And because of that, sometimes they were co-opted into helping with the actual camps. These young men got 3 meals a day. They got a bed. They were guaranteed $30 a month and medical care. Now, $25 of the $30 was withheld from their paycheck. They kept $5 a month. That's all they got. And the other money was sent to the family as a family help, since the family, if a young man was unemployed, there might be others unemployed also, and they knew they needed that help. Another thing that's really neat is high school completion was offered as an incentive. It was a little rough in terms of getting there, but there were quite a few people who completed their high school graduation through this service, and it's pretty neat. I've put this at the bottom, this place for you to go out at the nationalparkservice.gov for articles. Once you get there, just put in Civilian Conservation Corps, and you're going to find a few really good articles that really tell you what went on in this time. CCC came about as an official act of Congress called the Emergency Conservation Work Act of 1933. And it was a mandate, and a mandate that started producing results within 3 months, primarily meant to be in the nation's forests, parks, and fields, with states immediately asking for even more assistance than that. But they planted trees. They built flood barriers. They fought forest fires. They did forest conservation measures, like making sure that areas of the forest were thinned. And out of those programs came some of the great conservation measures that we have today. They did some range conservation projects. You'll see those over in eastern Montana. They did roads, they did trails, all kinds of things. In Montana, I'll show you before the end of this presentation, I will show you a stock pond dam project. Sometimes they built the camps themselves if they were not already something that had been up and running. For instance, in Missoula, for a while, they used some stuff at Fort Missoula, so they didn't have that need to build camps. They did U.S. Department of Agriculture identified projects that came along, just lots of things that had been sitting there that hadn't been done. Remember, when you have these national parks and you have state parks, those all have immediate needs, just in terms of trail mitigation, working with new trails, making sure that things are safe, all kinds of projects. How many did the CCC employ before it pretty much stopped in early 1942 with the advent of World War II? They know at least 3 million and probably more. Each year from 33 through 41, there were about 500,000 young men, and most all of them made a complete year out of it. If you're going to read that Tree Army book by Stan Cohen, it will show you lots of things, specifically, for example, with how they taught these young men to reduce fire risks. And that's worth its weight in gold, just for the pictures you will see. Let me tell you right now, it wasn't for everyone. In Montana, we did have a black camp, a camp for blacks, because we had about 1,200 African Americans living in Montana in 30, and nearly 1,000 African Americans came to work in the Kootenai National Forest as a CCC project. But unfortunately, there were national and local concerns over these integrated CCC camps, and it led to them being stopped after 1934. Remember, these CC impacts include things that are still going today and that are active projects. These were great examples of things that they found that were tremendously successful. Various kinds of forest management, the flood control stuff, and you'll see some things as you look through projects, especially at what we used to call the Montana Memory Project, and today it's the Montana History Portal. I found one that was just stuffed with pictures, and that one's fun. I'm going to show you a few of those things today. Various kinds of conservation projects, state park development. If you're looking, for example, and you ever get to go to South Dakota and you look at Custer State Park, that is just a model in terms of development for this that the CCC put together. It's very, very nice. National park development and improvements there. Virtually trails in every park we had at that point were improved and made safer. Forestry buildings, things like lookouts. I did not realize that. And historic site development where things were going downhill quickly and they needed to preserve older buildings. For example, things like at what had been Fort Assiniboine up near Havre. Again, it went from about 1933 to 1942. Here's some of the things they did. They planted over 2 billion trees. Amazing. They built over 125,000 miles of roads and trails that were in place by the end of 1942. They constructed more than 6 million erosion control structures. They spent 6 million workdays fighting forest fires. Remember, the Great Depression didn't just have dust. And you're going to be able to find some descriptive reports under the USDA, Department of Agriculture, under the National Park Service, which has great information, mainly in terms of the descriptions about various facilities and camps. Sometimes you'll find it under state park programs for various states. I'll warn you, I haven't found one yet for Montana, but that doesn't mean it's not there lurking. It's just probably not out where we can get to it yet, but maybe we can, if we find one or we find some, maybe we can encourage that they go out to the Montana History Portal. There are books and there are reports. There's a lot of memoirs. If you're looking for memoirs, one of the first things that you can do is go out and in quotation marks at Google, put in not just CCC, but put in Civilian Conservation Corps memoirs, and I found a bunch. There are individual camp histories someplace. These are a little harder to find than we might think. There are, however, some books of lists of men. We know that camp newspapers, I'll show you one that named everybody who was leaving that week, that there were camp newspapers available, and there were this thing called annuals, or what we would call yearbooks. My list, again, I've given you just primarily as a starter list of materials to read and review and look at. If you're going to Google search, then use CCC, but be aware you need to use it in quotation marks, and you're going to have to filter out some more things. Using the entire term Civilian Conservation Corps was better. You can do CCC and NPS, meaning the National Park Service, to bring up things that will help you there. CCC and USDA, you have to drill down there. I will say that. And then try things like CCC in a certain state. Georgia, for example, if you do a CCC in Georgia, in quotation marks, you're going to come up with a couple of great camp descriptors and work that they've done, actual studies that have been done on the work completed there by the CCC. And my understanding is they also have at least one very fine camp newspaper. I'm going to call your attention to the Odrich series by Robert W. Odrich. He's put out probably 7 or 8 books. We have one of them in our library that I'll show you in a minute. Things like, if you put in quotation marks, the CCC in Arizona, and he'll tell you, here's 4,000 names and addresses that he found from 2 1936 annuals from 2 Arizona camps. Or the CCC in Nebraska, Missouri, South Dakota, and Kansas, he comes up with 15,000 names. Similar again, one for Colorado with 26,000 names. In no place do I think he gets all of the names in a particular state, but he has made fantastic inroads. And he's got a couple of individual ones for Idaho for 1935 and 1936. The one I'm going to make you aware of is one I put on your sheet for you, the Civilian Conservation Corps enrollees in Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Just a little over 10,000 names from 3 annuals. These are primarily out in Washington. But I want to make you aware of the fact that even if you were from Montana, you could be sent to another state. Lots of our young men went out to Washington to some camps. The same thing again, you will find some of our people in Idaho. So don't just think that these people were enrolled, that they came from a state and stayed in that particular state. I think that Audrich's book on this makes it pretty clear. So keep that in mind. Audrich says in Washington State, he found a little over 44,000 men participating. Idaho, he found at least 21,000. Montana, 22,000. And way down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1937, there was the Direct Advertising Directory Company that published a 142-page long official annual with all the names for the Fort Lewis district out in Washington. Now, you just wouldn't think that would happen from Louisiana, but they must have been hungry for publications, or they got a contract for it. Probably both. Other things that you might want to borrow or buy, I suggest borrowing Graves and Potter's CCC, the story of the accomplishments and the personnel in the Pocatello district of 1935. This is just about 18 months after things started in Idaho, and they had great success in Idaho in getting their camps started and keeping projects moving. Most places did, but they've at least bragged about them in terms of the story of the accomplishments and the personnel who did them. They have that Chieftain Annual for 1936. I would go out and look at WorldCat if I were you, to try to find some of these. There's a study, a very, very fine study, done by a man by the name of John Salmond. The CCC 1933 through 42, a New Deal case study, came out of the Duke University Press in 1967. I think you probably are going to be able to find out where that can be found within the state, at least out at WorldCat. And then the CCC annuals for Fort George Wright District from 37 through 39. The things that would have been published for 40, 41 and beginnings of 42, by then things were getting pretty restless as we eyed the fact that we were probably going to be going to war, and a lot of the publishing within those camps falls off. You still can find some things, but in the early years, from 1934 through about 37 or 38, you'll find even more things from certain states. I would go out also, and at universities, take time to look for those studies done as master's theses or even doctoral dissertations to see what you might find with regard to camps. Usually there, the notes are going to be rich with at least some of the names. Other places to find information or records for you are things like the History Hub, which if you don't use this, historyhub.history.gov is a very fine place for you. I don't think I've suggested it before. That's funny because I've used it for quite some time. Maybe you have too, but it's a very fine place to find good explanations. And I would say that very occasionally you might find something in there that would be good for junior high, middle school students, but mainly it's high school and college and beyond. It'll give a nice overview. I think that a lot of their stuff is even way better than attempting to go out and just get stories on the web. the NARA records or the National Archive records. You could go out there. And I suggest no matter what, even though a lot of these personnel records I'm going to tell you about are out at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. They're on the civilian side, folks, not on the Army side. NARA still has other things you should be looking at that would be quite interesting for you. Camp newspapers, we hope, are being copied. If, for goodness sakes, you come across any, and I won't say that each camp had a lot of newspapers. They didn't. They had to do all the setting of type, all the things themselves. Sometimes they're not very legible anymore because they've faded. But if you find some of these, I would encourage you to get them copied and to see if we can't get them in some format where lots of people can look at them. When you look out at NARA, you're going to find that there were other kinds of reports. They did reports to find out if these camps were really doing well with these young people. And they also looked at places where there were problems. So you're going to find reports on areas that had some problems throughout time. At the National Archives, especially, I would tell you to go to Record Group 146. They're going to tell you that a lot of 146 is over at that St. Louis Center, but there are other things there that are pretty neat. Don't forget, out at FamilySearch.org, you want to go out there first and look up Civilian Conservation Corps. Just take the time to highlight it, make a copy of it for yourself and keep it on your desktop so you can find these things. They'll tell you even more about those personnel records and what's available for each person. They'll tell you about Record Group 35, which has some of those. It has a great deal of the personnel records, but it has other things also that have to do with individual camps. You're going to be able to access the individual records of the Civilian Corps. You will have to fill out a request form. Remember, they're going to want money for these, but they do not want the money until you have received the report, just the same as any place else, like going out to get a homestead or anything like that. So you will pay later on, but you can fill out that form and actually request the things that you want right online. The NARA Prologue magazine had one big issue on the first year of the CCC, and I think that's a real important one. So you begin to understand how fast this thing started, what they did to get the names of young men, and how they started getting camps ready to go. I have not been able to get the accident reports, but I look forward to seeing that because there were several accident reports in those years. And again, you'll find it out at Prologue magazine, but there's more than one of them. So I can't tell you just the title of one. A good way to describe that would be CCC accident reports in quotation marks. Again, those National Personnel Records Center are in St. Louis. They were not the records that burned in the military burn several years ago. They cost $25 to $70, depending on the file size. Now, I'll tell you, be reasonable. These files, a $25 file is 5 pages or less. That's it. But you will find some neat things about your family. Why, maybe even sometimes a brief statement as to why they're there, that they don't even have a home right at that point. The individual records actually go through 43 because it took them some time to collect some of those people who went directly out of the CCC and into the U.S. Army. And most all of those people were volunteers. And that was a great advantage for the U.S. Army because they'd already had a year of living together in camps, of having regular meal times established in a camp dining facility, of having uniforms of type that they were issued, and following rules from a camp. And that was just a great advantage for our country. we were able, in many cases, just to hit the ground rolling because these people already had this work ethic from the CCC. Camp inspection reports will be valuable. There were special investigators who went out when somebody said, hey, something's not right. It's going to give you the company number. It's going to give you the name of the place. I'm going to tell you a little bit in a few minutes about Camp Needmore in our state. I'm going to tell you the race of the enrollees, the date of the camp establishment, where it was, who were the military personnel in the camp that helped, what was the condition of the buildings and sanitation, and their actual medical services that they did have and their safety descriptions, and projects that they performed. It will not always be all of the projects. Some of them were small and they moved on from ranch to ranch in eastern Montana, in just a few days each time. But you're going to find out, what did they eat? Was it just beans and frankfurters? No. What were the standards of the educational facilities to get that high school graduation document? Recreational activities. You might see correspondence about problems or conduct of enrollees when they were not being nice some days. Records of special investigations arising from complaints or charges of mistreatment are there, and even fraud. So there's way more here than we might have even thought that there might be for these years. It was well documented for the few years that it actually operated. For example, here's one that you can find out at the national agency, the Federal Security Agency, on the Civilian Conservation Corps Division of Investigations. Here's a camp inspection report from Wyoming at Big Piney Camp in Sublette County. And this one is a fun picture. This is a group of CCCs who were there in Missoula County, actually completing a thing called the Butler Creek Bridge, getting that particular thing done with the help, of course, of bridge specialists who were showing them exactly what to do. So you will find some pictures, and even occasionally you're going to find that the people are identified right on the pictures. The one I want to tell you about is Camp Needmore. I found this out at the Montana History Portal, which we used to call the Montana Memory Project. This was a project at Ekalaka, and hopefully at least some of you have been to Ekalaka in the Custer National Forest. It was the Corps Camp F-53, and it actually operated in 34 and 35. That's when these records were there. And notice that they've got that nice little symbol over at the left. So if you can begin to recognize that, you see that on virtually all of their documents, and it really helps identify good stuff. Well, at Camp Needmore, they had a newspaper, and some of those things were shared within stories were shared in the camp newspaper, but they were also shared later on with newspapers as they did retrospectives on these particular places. So this one, you Helena people especially, this concerns Harry Ducello of Helena. He was 18 in 1935, and he enlisted in the CCC over at Miles City. He was a farm boy from near there. They took him all the way to Fort Missoula before his unit that he actually got into was transferred over again to the far east of Montana at Ekalaka. And he worked with the Forest Service south of Ekalaka, developing springs and doing fencing. See, there's two more things I hadn't even mentioned. During the winter of 35 and 36, they had such severe cold and winter weather, they really couldn't do a lot. So they were mainly in their barracks, and they took turns supplying firewood so they could at least live. Remember that at least they were earning some money and getting those standards and those good work habits. He was with the Ekalaka unit for 1 year, and he found his wife right there at a dance in Ekalaka. That was Genevieve Seaman. So you're going to find in some of these camp newspapers, and that's where I found this story, you're going to find stories like that. In fact, they look like this. The Ekalaka Eagle, at least some of it is out online at the Montana History Portal. And so here's the story on Harry Ducello of Helena. There's another one on Harvey Coons of Ekalaka. He stayed right there. He fought fire near Great Falls, actually. That's what Harvey did. And he was over in Southern Oregon and Northern California hauling gravel as a teamster and on a tree felling crew in Washington, all over the span of 1 year. So Harry Coons, or Harvey Coons, I should say, that's a pretty interesting story. Well, here's another story right there on Art Nix, who came from Moorhead, Minnesota, but he ended up in Montana. So when you see these stories, they're quite interesting, and you're going to be able to pick up some very neat biographical information about these people. I wish we knew who our people were here, because Andy and Helena, Andy and Bozeman, across this state, Missoula, because we could perhaps do some things with collecting some of the stories that have not yet been collected. It would be a great little project. So here they are at Camp Needmore on Memorial Day in 1940. This was just about the end of that camp. They were in parade formation. Notice that they were in Army-like uniforms, and that was not how they dressed all the time in work. So if you are thinking back to that picture I showed you a few minutes ago about the place in Missoula, they were much more roughly dressed. They were dressed for work there. They built storage dams for ranchers and for farmers. Those were just vital in terms of collecting water and making sure that water could be conserved in the eastern part of the states. This one has the names of some of the people at the bottom, but they don't identify where they are in this great group of young men. There were officers. And guess what? The Camp Needmore officers, at least two of them, had originally come from the military, although they were not current military when they served in 35. But here's one. Here's the camp. Here's what the buildings looked like that they lived in. Company 765 at Ekalaka. And it says that who the company officer was and who the subaltern was. They were using a lot of terms from former military types. There was a medical officer named there, and yes, he was a doctor, and an educational officer also. So that's a pretty nice looking little camp. I don't know if any of that is here today, but wow, what a neat picture to get of this. They had their own camp newspaper. It was called the Nodak Rambler. And this is the Easter time one in March of 1940. And again, it looks like it pretty much was done on, done by hand, pretty much, it looks like. But the neat thing is, I went into this and I only took 2/3 of the page, but those were all the names listed in just this particular unit who were leaving because they had completed their commitment as of Easter. So they were announced as leaving that week. They're not in alphabetical order, folks. I'll warn you of that. But boy, what a thrill it would be if you had a person who actually appears in this list. So you're going to find these names various places. And then even if you haven't found a name, if you have a suspicion, you need to go ask for their particular registration and the experience they had. So you can write a letter of inquiry to the National Park Service or to NARA or to a state forester's office, or again, primarily to that place in St. Louis that has the Civilian Conservation Corps records, and ask for information about your individual ancestor. And even if they don't find information about it, ask for information about any of the camp projects around you, what you suspicion they are, because there were some that didn't last very long, but they were there as projects, and some of them were intense. You want to be able to include these in your family story. They're really going to help explain some things about these young people and their needs and what they did or did not do in World War II and how this experience affected them later on. We know that it had a great effect on the U.S. Department of Agriculture, on the U.S. Forest Service, on various kinds of work camps that were established later on and have been established today. I have a letter that I've got, and I'm happy to share it if you want it. I just said, I am tracing my Uncle Roy. His name was Higgins. His history as a CCC enrollee. He was born in Wisconsin on 5/2, blah, blah. His parents were Oliver and blah. They moved to Montana in the 1930s, and I am sure Uncle Roy served his CCC enrollment at a Montana CCC camp. Now, I wrote this quite some time ago. I just thought it had to be because they wouldn't send him away. I mean, what if they sent him elsewhere? I really do think he just served in Montana, but he never said that much about it. But he was a great forester, folks. I do not know which camp, but he would have been living with his parents in Havre, Hill County, Montana, prior to enrollment. I would appreciate any assistance you can give me in finding out about my uncle's CCC service and the camp in which he served. Thank you in advance for your help. Best regards, Janet Thomson, and so on. I'm happy to share that format with you if you want it. It's just very basic. They don't want these letters to be long, but they want everything they can get. I would say one of the things that I need to tell them is that I need to tell him his middle name, because when I wrote this several years ago, I did not realize at that point how many Roy Higginses there would be. But Roy Lynn Higgins might help them quite a bit. If you find pictures or stories, please share these with people. Please bring them into your history society or your genealogy society and ensure that the heirlooms are scanned or saved as part of your family history. Make sure that if they wrote even a short memoir, a one-page memoir of what it was that they did, that you included in something like your historical society or genealogical society's quarterly, so that that story is remembered and it goes on into the future by more than just your family. Because remember, we're already we're very close to this having happened 100 years ago. It's not too far up. So some of these things are 90 or more years old, and you're going to want to save these because today kids might, since they haven't, a lot of young men, they do have to register for the draft, but they haven't had to go except as volunteers. So there are many people who are unfamiliar with these kinds of things that happened as a means to take care of families in that Great Depression. Well, that's my story for today. And I am going to take any questions you might have. It says, what do I have? I have an honorable discharge from, what does that say? The Civilian Conservation Corps, Gary Wolf. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Gary? Unmute yourself if you can.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, this is my father's. They were quite military in the CC, and this is his original discharge paper.
Woohoo! So where was he?
Also,
Tell us about him.
on the back of it is his record of service in the 3 camps that he served in up near Glacier Park.
Wow, that is stunning. Hopefully you've got extra copies of that, Gary, and that you share those with.
I have it in electronic format. I just scanned it today. I've
Okay.
had this for quite some time and had not done that.
Oh, that's wonderful that you've got that. Oh, Gary, where do you live?
We lived up near Columbia Falls, but the camps were just north of Columbia Falls, some of them in Glacier Park, some of them just outside the park.
Yep. You're
And
talking.
one story about Dad's first trip to the park, he was from Freud, Montana, very windy country. And he said the first time he got to the camp, everybody else was out working. So he just went out in the woods and sat down and couldn't figure out what he was hearing. And he finally realized for the first time in his life, he was hearing silence. When you grow
Wow.
up in eastern Montana, there's always a wind blowing.
Oh, yes, there is. Oh, yes, there is. Gary, where do you live today?
In Helena,
In Helena?
yeah.
Hopefully, if you feel so inclined, I hope you take that into at least your local historical society and share it with them. There's a national movement trying to get hold of some of these things. And so, not with the idea of doing any more than at least having examples of some of those things there so people even know what they're looking for. So I hope at some point that you share that either with the state or with the local historical society there. That's a wonderful treasure. He stayed just in Montana.
Yeah.
And what year was he in?
He went in April 13th of 1939 and got out in January of 1940.
Okay. All right. Anyone else have a treasure like that to share?
I do. About 8 years ago, I got the records for my father's time with the CCC from the National Archives.
Oh, that's wonderful.
An amazing amount of information.
Yeah.
That really was very touching to me to see even just what his height and weight was and what types of jobs he did and what his interests were. They even listed that. And at one point he started out, he lived in upstate New York and was placed there to begin with. And then I think his second 6 month tour, he went to Blanding, Utah, got in trouble because he broke camp sometime around his 19th birthday and happened to run into the commanding officer in the town. So he was docked like 2 or 3 days pay. And there's the report on that. And, he pled guilty, of course, because he was caught in town. But it's really a lot of really nice information.
So are you going to share that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've just had it and haven't known the idea of sharing. But what I'm curious about is that he was actually in over a course of 2 years. So he started in July of 39 and then left or April of 39. And it was almost 2 years, but I think there might have been a 6-month break or some type of break, and then he could reapply.
And sometimes they even took those people if they knew they were experienced CCC men and they needed some more help in a particular area. They were encouraged to come back.
Okay.
So what a fun organization. And when you think today of the various kinds of Job Corps camps, et cetera, that we've had, they're all modeled on those particular things, the work camps. What a great thing to get off the ground. But I couldn't believe it. Within 3 months, they didn't just have one camp going. They had camps in nearly every state going within 3 months. Anything else from anyone?